what truly is data strategy, and give you a little bit more insight into how to make data strategy practical. What is the purpose of a data strategy? How do you go about building one, etc. So a lot of interesting and practical content that we have tried to line up for today. So my name is Shri Salem. I'm a partner with ZS. I lead our data strategy practice. One of my focus areas within data strategy, data and analytics, broadly speaking, is formulating data strategy for clients and also helping them understand and realize the value of data that they have, and help them solve business problems and more efficiently using data strategies that we're going to talk about. I've had many different data leadership roles across organizations, and I do work across industries as well. So would love to have an engaging conversation with you all on data strategy. And let me quickly turn it over to Willem for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Sri. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Those also, listening to the recording later on. So my name is Willem Koenders. So I've been at CS now for well over 2 years. Spent all my working life, which is well over a decade now, on data. From all the way to top, the definitions of data strategies, but also down into operating model development and specific programs to implement and drive specific data capabilities. And I guess maybe more specifically relevant for today's session, have contributed to the definition of at least 25 data strategies across different companies in the last couple of years. So great to be here. Thank you all for being here. And thanks again for the introduction, Sri.
All right, perfect. So let's have a quick look at the agenda that we have for today. So we'll kick off with a definition of what data strategy is. We'll kind of parse through that, see where we typically get stuck with this type of definition as we broadly think about data strategy. And then we'll kind of get into some of the elements of data strategy or the components of data strategy. And we'll also give you some practical examples or case studies, or work with several different clients on how to build a actual data strategy. And of course, everything that we're going to talk about is rooted in work that we have done throughout with our clients. The one thing that we'll also try to do is we won't go through the entire presentation and then have the Q&A at the end, but rather what we thought we could do is we'll probably get to a point in the content where we want to pause for a little bit, take some questions, making this more interactive for you all. So hoping that you will benefit from that. And for some of you listening in, if you could please put yourself on mute. I'm hearing some background noise.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you. All right, so let's dive in and look at what a data strategy is, right? So here is our definition of what data strategy is. So data strategy is a mutually reinforcing set of choices relating to enablement and use of data that positions a company to win. So a mouthful, if you read it all together, but if you really want to parse through this, right, each of these individual words have a place in this definition. So data strategy at the root of it is about choices, right? So any strategy is about choices. So what do we mean by choices? You essentially think of it as, okay, I have the choice to do certain things, but I also have the choice to not do other things, right? So data strategy is also the same way, in terms of, taking these as a set of choices. It is important to qualify those choices as mutually reinforcing, because these choices are all not disparate choices, right? These choices will need to work together in terms of making sure that they reinforce each other, right? So they all move in the same direction, so we can create momentum for this data strategy. And what is the reason why we do this, thing about data strategy is it can position a company to win, right? So you could almost differentiate your entire company on a good foundation of data strategy. And many companies are doing that today, right? Companies that are differentiating themselves by building very functional and robust data strategies. And then how do we do it, right, is the part that, we highlight here in terms of, enablement and the use of data, right? So there are kind of two components to it. So data strategy helps you with the enablement component, which means that, you're bringing the right set of people, processes, and technology in order for you to activate or enable this data strategy or create value. And then, of course, the value realization happens by applying that data, which is now more useful than in its raw form. So you take the data and apply it to business use cases and problem statements, right? So that's how you get value from the data. So this is our definition of data strategy. And again, the reason we thought a definition was important here is, I've heard, in my career, at least even within data strategy, I've listened to a lot of different things, ideas and perspectives on what a data strategy is, and all the way from data strategy being synonymous to data governance to, data strategy is all about, sourcing external data, right? So I've heard a lot of these, differing perspectives. So we wanted to kind of, bring it together to say, hey, here is what data strategy could truly encompass. All right, so let's move to the next slide to look at what are the different components or the dimensions or capabilities of data strategy, right? So data strategy is fairly expansive. So it does touch on a variety of these capability areas. So we have a list of 13, and we'll go through some details in terms of how there are choices for each of these individual dimensions, right? So a couple of things that I want to quickly call out. So I'm not going to drain this slide. I'm not going to go through each one of these dimensions, but maybe a couple of important things that I want to call out is that there is a strategy almost baked in for each of these individual dimensions. So for example, if we do work on data governance, there is a data governance strategy, which will depend on a couple of other components or related dimensions, right? So data governance cannot be independent. You need to factor in other, foundational elements, such as, metadata, data quality could be related, reference and master data could be related. So a lot of these components, start to interact with each other, right? So that's why we will have a strategy almost for each of these individual dimensions. And then there are dimensions that we haven't, necessarily called out. So for example, one of the things that you probably won't find on the slide is, the sourcing of, third-party data, external data, and the relevance of that, right? Do you need a strategy for that? Absolutely, right? So as you think about, the use case enablement, that touches on, that external data. So what additional data would you need could be subcomponents of some of these, dimensions. So we're not listing every single aspect. Here are the key or the most prominent dimensions of this. It all starts at the very top, right? So the value management probably is the one that is most critical for you to then build off of, that high-level value statement in terms of translating a set of business objectives into a set of data analytics foundations and objectives, right? So it all starts at the top, and then you build all these other layers, on that foundation. So we'll give you an example of, how this is done and how it truly comes to life. A practical one, we have done this again with a variety of clients. So one specific client example on the next page, Willem, if you could go to the next one. Actually, before that, maybe I'll quickly talk about what is the value of a data strategy, right? So why do we need a data strategy, right? So it's often a question. Are you not seeing our screen? I see a comment on the chat.
Okay, others can see it. Okay, because it should be showing.
Okay, I think whoever can see it, I think it might be a problem on your side, because the vast majority say that they can see it. Okay, all right, so let's continue in terms of what is truly the value of data strategy, right? So in the last 15 years or so, when data strategy has been a prevalent topic of discussion, right? If you think about it, initially, data strategy was all about creating a reliable data infrastructure, everybody was thinking about, hey, how do we maximize, the volume of data that we can handle, and what could we potentially do with that data, et cetera. So there was a very strong emphasis on the data infrastructure and some of the foundations related to that. And then if you fast forward maybe 5-7 years later, maybe around 2015 or so, right? There was a significant emphasis on BI and reporting and analytics, right? So what could we potentially do with the data? What are some of the key things that we can do with the data, right? So there was a shift in data strategy from that infrastructure to now use of data for business problems. And then if you fast forward to the current times, I think everything that we are talking about is mostly related. Data strategy is trying to enable AI, right? It's trying to enable creation of data as assets. It's trying to drive Gen AI. So data strategy as a foundation is absolutely critical in terms of what our objectives are, even more critical today than possibly what it was like 12, 15 years back, right? So data strategy, the reason why you need that is to ensure that you can drive top line growth, operational efficiency, customer experience. Innovation is a huge thing, in terms of how can you leverage data strategy foundations to drive more use cases, and some of the foundational aspects around creating data products and data as assets, right? So all of these are direct outcomes of a very strong data strategy. When we measure a success of a data strategy, we truly look at these as the levers or the litmus test, for whether a data strategy has truly served its purpose or not, right? If you go to the next page, Willem. So I want to go through a practical example of how do you take something that is very high level in terms of a business objective, right, at the highest level, and how do you translate that? How do you drill down deep to a data strategy and some of the foundational elements of data and analytics, right? So we did this work, with a very large, B2B client, in the logistics space. So one of the objectives, for this client was, okay, we need to drive 5+% top line growth in the US, right? And the levers that was responsible or were responsible for driving that, would include small and medium business penetration. So that was a customer segment that they wanted to go after. They were also looking at some of the cross-border opportunities, right? So US to Canada, for example. They were looking at customer retention as a potential lever to drive this top line growth. And then if you double click on this SMB penetration, which is small and medium business penetration, there are again several levers in which you can pull in order for you to drive that. So this would include your sales and marketing enablement. You could have new products within that SMB space in which are geared towards that particular customer segment. You can have partnerships in terms of selling your products and services with other companies, right? So there are many other levers here. And then if you double click on the sales and marketing enablement function, there are several subcomponents of that. So lead generation, for example, is one. How do you drive new leads? How do you segment customers and profile those customers so we can understand which segments are we resonating best with, right? So that's a lever. Campaign effectiveness is another lever. So there are several levers under sales and marketing enablement. So now as you go from that sub-function level to the enabling capabilities level, this is where the true pivot happens, right? So until this point, all of the language that we've used is business language. We are talking about strategy and decomposing that strategy into business levers, right? And now when you go from the sub-function to the enabling capabilities, this is where then you are now speaking a data language, right? You are now saying, okay, what are the capabilities I truly need in order for me to drive lead generation? What are the capabilities I need from a data analytics perspective in order for me to drive customer segmentation? So this could be, you need to look at data supply. What do you have? Both in terms of internal data, external data. Do you have data sufficiency for you to be able to do this, right? You need to be thinking about customer data and how you manage and govern that data, right? Without enabling data management on the data, there is no way you can get the value from the data. You need to be thinking about analytics, right? So do you have the right set of analytics competencies in order for you to drive these use cases, right? Whether it is segmentation or prediction for churn or whatever the use case might be. And then there is one level deeper, which is the foundational building blocks, right? So these building blocks are truly the capabilities that we need in order for us to ensure we make progress. And these building blocks could be around third-party data. These building blocks could be around customer MDM. These building blocks could be around data quality frameworks, governance, right? So there could be a lot of these different building blocks that enable us to make this actionable. And there are some levers here that we are not showing, or layers beneath this which we are not showing, right? This foundational building block could further be decomposed into several work streams or initiatives, which then become those practical work streams or projects, right, that your companies are driving. So you have owners and you have resources allocated to that, but not losing sight of this broad goal that you're trying to achieve, right? So that's how overall a business objective or a strategic objective gets translated into something very tactical from a data perspective. Willem, if you go to the next slide. So I'll make one more quick point here, in terms of these different strategic pillars that we talked about. I drill down deep, specifically within the SMB penetration as one pillar. But if you look at some of these other pillars, you could repeat the same exercise across, any one of these, right? And then when you come down to these enabling capabilities, what you're going to find is there are going to be some common threads. There are going to be some common enabling capabilities in master data, or it's going to be common enabling capabilities, in terms of third-party acquisition. There are going to be common enabling capabilities in terms of personalization and whatever you need. So this becomes your method to almost prioritize which ones you have to build, right? And then which ones can be down the road in the roadmap. We'll get to the questions in a few minutes, but just wanted to finish this section and also give you one or two more practical examples of this so we can have a fairly rich conversation around this. Willem, if you go to the next one. So now here, the bottom layer that you see here is the enabling capabilities and the foundational building blocks. Like I said, this is where the data analytics, the data strategy truly comes to life, right? And then we spoke about these 13 different capability areas. Now it is all about mapping this onto these capability areas and making these choices, right? So if you remember me talking about data strategy as a set of choices, so this is where the choices really truly come into effect, right? So Willem, if you could maybe talk more on this.
Yep, absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll blow up the table on the right into a new page here. And what I'd love to do now is I'll talk through these 13 capability areas, probably quite quickly, but like to indicate that there's really choices that you can make. I believe at least one of the almost a pet peeve but in any case something that we've observed in the literature or in kind of the different frameworks that are out there, especially around data management and data governance, is when you read it, it kind of tends to be written as in like, here's the way to do it, right? And I think there's at least from two different dimensions, there really are choices that you can make. One, in terms of there are different ways that you can enable a certain capability. And second, like you can do some things in let's say with more prioritization and focus than the others. Like which ones do you focus on because the ROI is higher? So having said that, like let me just maybe talk through these quickly to kind of indicate some of those key choices that exist to make it very real, hopefully, for you guys. So the first one around data strategy itself, like the highest level strategy, the biggest, the most common choice you have is are you going to formulate a strategy that's very offensive, or is it one that's going to be very defensive, right? Offensive is all about the data that you have, maximally making it available to, the business, the data scientists, the analysts that are out there that need this data, versus defensive strategy that focuses more on control. Like you want to have the data in a certain place, that it's locked down, it's protected. And you can do a bit of both of these, but like in terms of your overall strategy and where you decide to invest, when you pick one or the other, really impacts everything else that's on this page actually. So to kind of help enable that. So if I go, maybe I'll take the next one around use case enablement. Like there's something around the use case enablement here where you have a choice around how are you going to prioritize and drive the use cases? Like there are organizations out there, especially that are a little bit more mature and that are maybe a little bit tight for capital, have a very strict ROI framework. They may have a very set benchmark, like within 3 years, you need a certain percentage needs to be earned back already, versus you're actually very openly considering proof of concepts in certain areas. Like what's your operating model around driving use cases? Maybe business BI and analytics. There may be a focus on descriptive analytics that kind of helps to establish certain causal connections, versus you focus more on the predictive or the prescriptive AI. Sometimes that's a bit of a maturity curve where you have to first be able to do one before you go to the other, but it tends to be true that you can't fully focus on all of them at the same time. Then maybe the next couple of ones are a little bit more about how do you emphasize certain elements of governance and control. So data architecture, for example, is a really great one where sometimes the central data organization doesn't even call it out, does not even mention it. Like we're right now working with a big global company where there's actually the first time ever that they kind of realize that, wait a minute, like to be able to drive this data strategy, we should actually probably have certain guidelines in place that guide future architectures. Versus you also being able to make a deliberate decision, especially if business units are very independent, or maybe there's regional organizations, things like that, that you retain flexibility for new technologies, right? Absolutely choices in here to the extent of control. Similar for data storage and operations, maybe not the most interesting here, most relevant typically, but you can control that very strongly centrally versus tolerating shadow IT organizations. Sri and I myself have been in some interesting interactions between the central teams and these kind of shadow IT teams, and as they try to figure out like what's the role of each of them. The next one I think is I personally found very interesting because it's a real not so much a choice in terms of control or not control, or priority or not a priority, but like how you can do it. And so when we consider integration interoperability, what you really want to make sure is that as you have data from different sources, different systems in your organization, like are you able to kind of match these bits of data together, and can you relate them to each other? Let me see if I can
ohne politische Erfahrung, ein
read
Moderator,
someone here.
der die letzten 10
Marcus?
Jahre aber beim Fernsehsender Fox Donald Trump intensiv.
Mute. Sorry, I muted you. Apologies. Where was I? Integration, interoperability. So there's a real choice on how you can do that. So for example, one way of doing that is actually just specifying the tools you can use. So for example, if you're an Azure shop, maybe you would specify it's Azure Data Factory plus maybe one or two others, maybe plus MuleSoft as an API layer, and that's it. And it's almost by definition, like as long as you use that, you're by definition able to interact with everything else that is out there. Like that's almost like where you help to do this by rationalizing which tools to use, versus interoperability standards where you actually leave open the technology that people use, because you might, again, if you have strong business units, there might be a group of people that really likes Databricks, another one that really likes DataRobot, etc. So, but where you focus more on interoperability standards, like that is to say, like what are the rules and protocols in terms of the language, in terms of data models, maybe quality controls or metadata standards, but like standards, like as whenever you build a new data flow, those are standards you need to meet, right? Two completely different ways of how you can actually do this in practice. I'll maybe skip a couple of these just for the sake of time. Data governance can be one that's also very common to be considered very relatively early on in a data strategy development, in terms of to what extent are you going to do things centrally, right? There's typically always a minimum amount of things around, definition of the framework and the roles and responsibilities that you would always do centrally. But then in terms of doing actual work to document these and implement them, like that's where you can start to lean heavier on the decentralized teams in your organization. Data quality, another kind of personal favorite of mine in this particular dimension, is where you have at least two different ways that you can prioritize the work to be done. Like one is to really focus on all the data that you have today, all the systems that are already there, they're producing data, and you put a framework in place to be able to measure that data. Like very common, for example, in the financial sector where I spent a lot of time, where you have a dashboard of data quality and certain thresholds, and whenever it's below a threshold, it automatically creates an issue that is then remediated. Like, but it's really focused on that legacy landscape that you have, versus a bit more future-oriented perspective around built-in controls. It's really about, hey, whenever we're doing something new, like and any big company always has a transformation of some sort somewhere in the company. Like it could be a Salesforce implementation, it could be a digital journey, it could be many different things. But how do we make sure we have a seat at the table there, and we at least influence it to such an extent that data quality is now incorporated by design into the architecture and into the fibers of the solution. Metadata management, maybe real quick. So that might be one that's a little bit more around like how important are you going to make this as part of your overall data strategy? Because on the one hand, again, like metadata, right? Data about the data is the big enabler of any other data capability. But at the same time, like gathering it can be prohibitively expensive. It can be a big effort. So are you going for a set of minimally required attributes, maybe at a system or at a data asset level, versus are you going to insist yes or no on lineage? Like one of the most difficult business cases that we've had to build in the past is around lineage. Like what lineage do you want to capture at what level? So very, very kind of can be a very salient point in your data strategy. Let's see if there's maybe something else. Maybe let me pick out data modeling for a second while I hit another mute button. Like if I look at the data modeling data capability here as well, you have a really cool choice between, on the one hand, you building your data model yourself internally, like what are your domains, your logical attributes, etc. But you can also make a commitment to actually using an external one, right? So there's an external POV that we can share the link of, where we kind of lay out the different scenarios, like when either of these two options, it becomes a better one for you. And where kind of the most important dimension is the more data, the more your competitive advantage is dependent on you having to exchange data with other third parties, the better the business case becomes to just committing to an external data model. So I kind of just walk through probably 70-80% of these capabilities to give you guys an idea about the real choices that you can make as part of your data strategy. And I think we're going to give one more example before we pause for some questions and answers. One last comment on this page is that they're not independent. So again, where the data strategy comes in is where you connect these different decisions across these different dimensions into one coherent strategy. Like you kind of lay out, here are the choices we're making, here's the investments we're going to make, because this is the configuration that is going to support these business use cases that we have the best. And to give you a hopefully very tactical example of such a use case, again, to make this as real as we possibly can in kind of the span of an hour, we wanted to take an example that we've looked at another global kind of technology company that we've worked with in the last couple of years. And specifically, this one is about closed loop marketing. So before I go kind of step by step, explain that one really quickly. So closed loop marketing is all about you wanting to have the capability to see as you make investments in certain marketing campaigns, to see how the investment in those marketing campaigns is translating themselves into opportunities and then sales. So it's like where you kind of go from marketing to opportunities to sales, and then you need to close the loop back to your initial marketing campaign so you can like realign them or change them so that you have a maximum impact. So that's kind of the use case that we take here as one of these examples that Sri earlier had, also from, you know, to kind of drive down to those foundational building blocks. So this case, this company had a global goal of 2% revenue growth from enhanced data-driven insight. That was something that they had prioritized. And then this particular use case is one of the main ones. They were not able to do it before, and they wanted to be able to actually have a quantified understanding of how effective their marketing was. So at the business intelligence and analytics layer level, what you need is some basic dashboarding for sure to track the different spends, the sales numbers, as well as the ROI numbers, right? It's just visualization, but that's kind of what you'd need at a BI level. But that just gives you the visualizations. You still need to actually integrate AI because, again, like the marketing investments may be done, say, in January, but like whether the sales numbers, they may have an uptick, let's say in like a week later, a month later, a year later, and there's also a lot of noise in this data. So you really do need to train an algorithm to be able to kind of establish this causal connection. So that's where the AI bit comes in. Any of this is, I wouldn't say a piece of cake, but it's relatively straightforward if you have the right data from the right sources available at your fingertips, right? So it's reliable, it's secure, you know how to interpret it. That depends on you having data from at least 3 different domains. I just hinted at them in the beginning. An operational data from the marketing campaigns, for example, the data from the opportunities, and from the sales. Those are 3 typically independently created data sets. Just having them in a silo is not enough, right? You need to be able to connect them. Like these specific identifiable data assets need to be able to be integrated together. That integration depends on some level of security. In this case, not that heavy because it's not that hypersensitive, but there were some given that some of this technology was used in a medical context, there were some comments around potentially, you know, PHI data, but like nonetheless, like that you do need to have a framework to be able to guide that integration. That in turn depends on ownership, right? It's a data owner who typically has the roles and the responsibility to understand what its data is and what are appropriate use cases. Just back to the other side of the slide again, if you can bear with me, like just having the data stored or having it available is not enough, right? It needs to be complete and accurate, typically in terms of the data quality dimensions like validity, consistency, completeness, etc., like things like that. That depended, in this case, on a minimally required master data management solution or capability. Because again, if you think about the closed loop marketing use case where you have a marketing team who's registering kind of the campaigns they run, like relationship managers who are registering the opportunities, and a finance team who's creating the sales, like they all need to be able to relate to a certain product hierarchy that needs to be mastered, or you can't make any sense of the data that's being created. So that was a very strong, like, foundational capability that was required. Then the next 2 that appear here are around the metadata management and modeling. Nothing of what I just said around quality, about MDM, interoperability works without minimally required metadata, which in turn depends on a model where you've defined your logical attributes, right? Ideally, you don't have different system teams. It happens, sadly, too many times. So I could do this on their own, but like to do that in some level of consistency. All of this needs to somehow be brought to the organization in a way that it actually works, right? So that's where the change management comes in. Hopefully, a very tactical example of where you take one use case, and like in some projects, we took, you know, the top 10 or top 15 to follow a similar process like this to identify like what are actually these things that are required to truly enable it. But that kind of is hopefully a very real example of how these foundational capabilities can be brought to bear to enable higher level strategic goals. I think we reached the point to take some questions.
Yeah. So I think we can do some questions. So I see a few of them already here in the chat. So a couple of them are really around the value creation and how do you articulate the value, right? That you create from the data strategy. So I'll maybe start on Willem, please add your thoughts.
Yep.
I think, the most simplistic way to, I guess, tell the value story for data strategy, as you all know, is really making the connection of, data to use cases, or the business problems that we are trying to solve for, and then say, hey, these business problems are associated with, whatever, 5% revenue growth, 10% operating efficiencies, or, 3%, customer service improvement, or whatever that, story is, right? But actually a better answer, I think, to that question could be how you start this value articulation from the bottom up. So when I say bottom up, this value starts from the data foundations, and a lot of these different components that Willem is talking about, right, is not reflected when you just say, hey, I solve these 5 use cases, and that is enabled by data strategy. So therefore, data strategy is worth X, right? So no, that's maybe a very simplistic answer, but I think a more robust answer here could be, first, let's talk about the value of these foundations, right? So the foundational value can initially be measured in terms of, for example, how many domains are you catering to, right? If you really segment your entire sort of data portfolio into different data domains, how many domains are we, really catering to? How many data assets are being certified today, right? How many data assets are really going through this rigorous, data quality framework and process? So we can start to measure the value at the foundational level, right? And then one level up is where you then translate that into more of the, what I would call is like operational metrics measurement. So here you're thinking about, okay, because I did these things, in the foundations, that's all it means to an end to something, right? And that something now is all about, am I getting more users, using, my, data sets, in the data lake? Am I getting more adoption, right, to use these platforms and, dashboards, that I've created? Am I able to solve for these business problems with a greater speed and accuracy, right? Initially, maybe it took me like, 6 months to build this one marketing mix model. But now, given that all of the underlying work that has happened with customer data, for instance, now I can build that same model, not in 6 months, but in 6 weeks, right? Am I able to get to that? Am I able to get to more use cases, right? So initially, maybe I was just solving for, call it like, marketing as the primary function, but can I now do supply chain? Can I do other things, right? And in terms of use cases. So that is the mid layer that's often missing in that value story, right? And then the layer on top, which is what we always care about, is ultimately what is the resultant in terms of that particular use case or business problem associated with revenue impact or operational efficiency, etc. So that's how I would usually tell that story in a kind of an end-to-end fashion. Willem, any thoughts?
No, I'll leave with that. I just posted 2 links in the chat as well to those questions that I think pertain to this, where both you and I have kind of written about this, I think, in a little bit more detail. If that's if you, especially if you like this value quantification, if you really want to push yourself to get to that dollar number, right? That's maybe just for sake of time, I just put the links in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have been doing this with clients. Again, this has been one of the most asked questions, top of mind questions for, clients in terms of how do I tell that value story, right? How do I make that business case for even creating a small data strategy outfit within the larger, enterprise data organization, right? So we are definitely, answering those questions with a value, number.
And
All
I
right.
and I would just say, add to that, maybe, Sri, is I think very often they ask the initial kind of question, like, I want a percentage of return or a dollar number, because they want to see a strong articulation, right? But like when you're able to tell a story like we just did on this page, most of the business executives buy into it. Like, it becomes clear to them already. And it is often, if you then express, even across things like a data catalog, an MDM platform, and all of that, even if it comes to like $20 million or something like that, as if you now have conclusively tied that to a set of 20 use cases who jointly drive, are related to $2 billion of revenues, like, the story becomes so much different already. Like, not to say that you shouldn't push yourself to actually get to the actual dollar denominated numbers, like, do it anyway. That's a good thing to do. But usually this first step, like being able to tell this story, but for your organization, gets most of the business executives already pretty comfortable with the investments that you're asking for.
Yeah. Maybe let's go to some of the other questions. I think we have a really good set of questions here. Would you do capability mapping for all business objectives, right? So if you go back to that, maybe that slide where we showed that, bookends, Willem, of how do you translate a business objective to a mapping of underlying, data capabilities. In reality, you would do it for, all of the key business objectives, because, some of these capabilities are going to be driving multiple of those business objectives. For example, a customer MDM is not only relevant, for one particular lever. I think we talked about like small and medium business penetration, right? It could also be relevant for a different type of a use case, right? So we want to ensure that we are connecting all the dots here, because that's what makes the business case more powerful. Because you would never want to build a massive MDM platform for customer or something else, just purely based on one particular pillar or one particular business objective. So this is where there is a lot of interaction back and forth, right, between the enterprise data team and some of the functional data teams. If you have a functional data team, they're typically collaborating with the enterprise team to get the story correct, right? So we are taking needs from across the enterprise, we are bringing it together, and then we are saying, hey, finally, as we distill these 5 or 6 business objectives, here is where we net out in terms of capabilities, and here is where we net out in terms of the work streams and initiatives.
Yep. I would just maybe add one additional thought here, which can kind of sometimes help to start simplifying this. Is like what you don't necessarily want this entire exercise to forever be in like PowerPoint pages like this. That becomes like very hard to kind of maintain. And so what tends to help is connecting this type of thinking to, for example, taking let's say putting out their marketplace or a catalog of sorts, right? Which basically show here are the most critical, depending on your organization, 10, 15, 50, maybe like data assets that are all supported by common investments in data quality and interoperability and things like that. And these assets are now in that kind of capability, which is data capability itself. In the catalog, they're kind of mapped to these use cases and they're being kept relatively up to date, right? That's kind of like where some of this, where the initial push may be, the first couple of times you kind of have to go through these step by step in this type of format, but eventually that should become almost business as usual because use cases change too, right? And new data comes up. Like it's not that you've done it once and you're done. I think there was one other question around data quality of the organization and the time required to reach that, the value will differ. Maybe Sri first, or do you have a thought on that already?
Yeah, I think similar to what I just mentioned, on kind of building some of the value story around the foundations. I think it is important for us to build that value story for data quality as well, right? So data quality may not, the initial effort or push may not get you to everything that you need, but I think there are certain things, certain dimensions of data quality that you can look at, right, to solve for. So your initial measurement could be about, am I getting consistent, accurate data, right? And maybe some of the other aspects, dimensions of data quality, will come a little bit later. But with consistent, accurate data, you're already making some big improvements in terms of your use cases and how the data is being used for that, right? So that is the story that we need to say. And it's not a flip of a switch as to getting to that data quality right away, but there are going to be stages in that transition. Willem, anything from you?
No, I think that pretty much matches it. I would just say, like, I wouldn't ever really go back into a data quality effort and go back measure all data everywhere. Like I would either do either of the following as part of your strategy, almost not knowing anything about where you are. Like one, I would tie it into an effort that is focused on specific strategic data assets and like focus the data quality effort there. That just tends to have a much better ROI. And two, also like forward looking versus backward looking. Like the ROI and you getting it right going forward, the story is harder to tell, but the ROI is so much higher.
Yeah. I think that reminds me of another thing, right? So you would never want to tell the story or articulate the story in terms of just data quality alone, right? Sometimes, that kind of a business case or value articulation doesn't really land, well, if you're taking a business case to, the senior leaders, right? What you would want to tell is maybe package this up in terms of like how do you create certified data assets? How do you create a single source of truth, right? When you talk about, that level, data quality, data governance, and a lot of the metadata, right? Data stewardship, all of this becomes part of, this larger block. So you can it's very easy to build a business case around something like that versus just say, hey, how do I go from data quality maturity 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and show the value, right? It's harder to tell that value story if you just take a very small sliver of this foundation.
Yep, data products, I can see it. Yep, very common. We try to
Yep.
push for those too.
Exactly, absolutely.
Awesome. All right, maybe I'll keep going for a bit, Sri, while and a new question came in. While maybe you take a look at that one while I continue with
Yeah.
the next page, just for the sake of time as well, because I'm having fun and time flies. So maybe somewhat quick. I wanted to talk through one more example across these capabilities. I won't go one by one, but just to kind of show like the different types of data strategies or the different ways that you can push that in a certain direction. And so the last one was very much focused on a couple of commercial use cases that ended up driving the enterprise data strategy for even at the enterprise level. In this case, the retail company made a deliberate decision to basically commit to working with AWS. Like that was one of the big decisions that were made as part of the data strategy, because when they considered all of the decisions across these capability areas, like that just made sense for them, right? So I'll talk through a couple of them to show you how that worked, right? So at a data strategy level, the highest level, it was offensive here as well. Retail company weren't really concerned, if at all, with any sort of compliance really from a regulatory perspective. They focused really on customer and product data domains. That was the other part of the data strategy. Not all data everywhere, but really those were the two domains that if we get those right, a lot of other stuff will follow, they felt, right? So those were kind of the big decisions they made. And then if I go down a little bit and kind of like start seeing now, once you've had that initial, let's say, framework or shape of your data strategy, a lot of the decisions kind of follow now, just following the logic, right? So if you look at the BI and analytics layer, well, you have a whole suite of AWS apps around QuickSight, SageMaker, etc. That those are now the tools to use. For example, they just made sure that they came accompanied with the right quick access and training. Anyone, anywhere that had a use for these types of applications, like was able to nearly self-service to find their ways to these tools. Yep. So if I pick maybe another one around a data architecture, I mean, they followed the AWS architecture. The big advantage here is that if you actually commit to this, like they have ready to go off the shelves architectures for blueprints for pretty much anything you need for like analytic environments, the landing zones, all of those things. Data storage, similar. Like they were able to have a centralized control and especially around like minimally kind of access controls as well as budget tracking. But other than that, like the local teams were able to give their own environments. Like all of this now follows a common AWS best practices. Integration interoperability, well, there's the common set of tools. That's how you would do it, because you have an AWS set of tools, pretty much like you have in Azure and Google. Of course, any sort of ingestion type of question that you may have, integration ask that you may have. That maybe one thing to call out that isn't necessarily a given, given that they chose to partner with AWS here, which is the data governance layer here, right? And so like they did really focus heavily around making sure that that technology choice they made, which is driving so many other things, came accompanied with a data governance process and domain ownership. So they had like certain processes that you would tie to establishing a data mesh, like around defining what's an asset or a data product and what is not, like what are certification criteria, things like that. And then specific domains with their owners and stewards, right? So the customer and product domain, they got very strict ownership and stewardship controls. let me see. Metadata management, for example, like they weren't necessarily that interested in it. There wasn't a regulatory requirement to do so. But given that it was all natively in AWS, like you could use the Glue data catalog anyway, because some of that is the majority of it was automated anyway. So they did it. It was easy to do that. And one other choice around master data that is not really strongly provided by the AWS, in landscape at all. So they did you kind of tag on a Reltio capability for that, but again, hosted on AWS. And then maybe one last final decision they make was they chose to adopt an external data model. It's RIDM. I think retail industry data model, if I'm not mistaken. That was the data model they adopted for these key domains, and it really gave them a very kind of clear, track, the set of standards to follow. So just another example of a data strategy. And a data strategy is not a table like this, right? It's a narrative with a couple of slides or a couple of things to it that tells the story across these different dimensions. Like, what are we trying to do? What are the key things we focus on? What are we trying to enable? And like these decisions were helping to inform that data strategy. But I think hopefully another clear but very different example.
So I see a couple of questions here. I think one of the questions is really around who are the key stakeholders, right, that need to be part of this data strategy, development and value articulation. Willem, I think if you could go to slide 17, maybe for a quick second, we can flash it up. It might entail a longer conversation, but I do want to share something really quick with you all. Again, what you see here on the screen is, there is a specific, method to this madness, in terms of how do you formulate a data strategy and who are the different folks, stakeholders, that are going to be involved, right? And there is always a very healthy collaborative interaction between the enterprise data strategy team and the business unit and the function, right? We typically refer to this as a W process because, initially, we get some inputs from enterprise data strategy. And if you're a business unit and function, you're taking that, you're fleshing that out, you're providing it back to the enterprise. And then the enterprise essentially consolidates all of the inputs that they're getting from the different business units and function, right? So then they are creating a master plan or a master strategy. And then that gets rolled down again to the business unit or the function, and they flesh it out, refine it further, and that ends up being the final kind of the data strategy playbook, right? So that's typically the process that, we follow. So this is very similar to, any of the business planning, annual planning processes, that you're all familiar with. So, data strategy follows a very similar kind of a process. So if you go to the next slide quickly, maybe let's talk a little bit about ideally what are the roles or the stakeholders that you need, because this is going to be a story that is not coming from just one individual, right? So there are lots of inputs. It's a very collaborative exercise. So of course, if you have a chief data officer, if there is a data lead sitting in the enterprise, that individual is going to lead a lot of this, right? That top down that push is going to come from this individual, right? And also, by definition, that individual is not just a technical data expert, but that individual needs to be extremely well tuned to the business, right? So one of the reasons why many of these CDOs have not been successful in their roles, you might have read all these perspectives on, the average tenure of a CDO is less than a year and all that, right? So that's primarily coming from the point that these CDOs are not in tune with the business, they're not understanding the business, right? So these CDOs, if a really good CDO is to drive data strategy, he or she will immediately start to look at the business objectives and start to translate that, right? And then they are working with a identified data lead on the BU side or the functional side, right? So they're actively having these dialogue so they can create that value equation. So I know I went through a lot maybe in the last few minutes, but there is a process. And again, if any of you is interested in having a deeper discussion, there is a very robust process and through which we do this. All right, so let's look through some of the other questions.
I think there was one around how important it is to understand the business, kind of a business literacy. And then kind of the follow-on point around like we're focusing so much on technology of the data while we're not collaborating effectively with business unit leaders. I mean, I don't think you can find two people on this world who would probably agree with that more than Sri and myself. Like, I mean, that's what we say all the time from the get-go, and hopefully that's what you've seen actually in this presentation already as well, right? Because that's where we started with like understanding what the you know what the business is about, what your objectives are, like why that's important, and how you could enable them. And so, absolutely, for your data team, that is critical to be able to do. I don't know if that is equally relevant for every single member in that team, but you definitely need to have the folks that excel at you know the interaction with the business, right? And that includes a basic set of social skills as well. Like literally forget about governance and all the other stuff and technology, but like you just are able to listen and interpret. And then the other part is that you understand the business enough to be able to convert it into a set of requirements that make sense across your data strategy dimensions, right? So to be able to then make the connection to, oh well, if it's a type of process where you want to have certain insights be integrated into a model that are, you know, is updated overnight, well, that has certain requirements for your stack, right? That you have a real-time connection, that the integration is there, etc. So
Perfect. I know we are at time, but maybe you know, we are happy to stay on for a couple more minutes if there are any other last minute questions.
you can come off mute too if you want to ask them directly. Anyone? We won't bite.
I have a question, Willem and Shri. It's Govind here from India. I'm managing the data strategy, a part of the capabilities here at CSE. And one thing that I'm dealing with as a bit of a challenge is Shri just pointed it out recently. You know, the W basically, right? So the W is really long, right? It's W that goes, because the number of business units and the number of people who want to have their own local business data driven strategy are disconnected in different views. So how do you suggest we try to normalize them and bring it to a string of sorts?
Yeah, I think it needs to be, you know, similar to any business planning process. It needs to have a set time frame, right? So we cannot run a data strategy process in like, you know, in a month, if you will. And it has to be a little bit more extended. You know, it could be a 3-month time period. But the good news is, you know, once you build that core data strategy, you know, do this in a process or over a 3-month period, then everything on top of that becomes a, you know, a refresh or a tweak, right? Because these strategies don't change, right? Strategies should not change by definition, right? So if you're changing your strategy every year, that means that you fundamentally have not, you know, set the right strategy. So what I would suggest is, you know, build that process initially. So have this, you know, W model work for you, you know, with the right individuals identified in, you know, both at the business level as well as the functional level. And, you know, if you could run this process, you know, in the same parallel time frame as any of your, you know, annual planning process, because you could almost like use the same template, the same, you know, kind of, you know, intermediate steps, right, as you go through the process. That would be, you know, a great way for you to piggyback the data strategy on the process. And then, you know, once you have built, like I said, you know, a good foundational strategy, then you can iterate on it.
Yep, just adding one thought to that is that if you're really early on in your process of doing this and there hasn't been a set strategy for a while and maybe all the teams are not there yet, then you have to kind of put some effort into this, right? You have to bring people actually together into workshops and working sessions and maybe ad hoc meetings. But like eventually, hopefully, like as part of your rollout, you'll likely have a set of forums as well, right? So you'll have let's say a data council or a data governance forum or things like that, where you hopefully have a like monthly or bi-monthly kind of checkpoint where you have a bit more managed way of getting feedback that can then be validated by a set of, let's say, pre-validated stakeholders, you know, at that point. That tends to really help as well, right? To make this become a living thing. Yeah, that's controlled.
Oh,
Maybe
that's
one
great
last question.
perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe one last question we can answer. So I've seen cases where execs, don't want the details of data capabilities and what should be important in that conversation, right? Because they don't, to your point, and they don't care about metadata or data governance. They want to know how it impacts their business. So I think we kind of touched on it. So the story here is not about metadata. The story is not about governance. The story is going to be about these, larger blocks, whether you want to call it like, data assets or data products, and showing if you did not do that, right? As much as saying that, this is going to drive, revenue, top line, bottom line, etc. It's also giving that other perspective of if you did not have this, certified data product, what are you not able to do? What are you not able to capture in terms of market opportunities? Why would you not be responsive, to that, need, right? So that's one way, you could, try delivering that story. Willem, any other thoughts?
Yeah, examples like where you have something that went wrong, like where you have or went well, or like where you like look at metadata, for example, like if there's some example of something that particular stakeholder cares about, like just make it very practical. Like how could whatever something happen and cause them harm or success, like how is that caused by let's say in this case metadata. Just take an example, and like sometimes that makes it a lot easier, right? For example, data quality is very abstract all the time, but if you explain to a business stakeholder that you're trying to call up an executives who changed the key account 2 months ago, like that's very easy to imagine, right? Like why that's a painful thing. So like examples, making it very practical examples relative to this specific individual is probably something you should have ready.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you're not going to win this battle, right? By pushing hard on telling the story at the data governance level or metadata. That's just the reality. So I think we will need to pivot from those conversations to making it more exec ready for consumption.
Yeah, I think this is sometimes still hard, to be honest, for me to sometimes not kind of be tempted into that explanation, but yeah.
All right. Thank you all for staying a little bit over. Again, we are happy to share the content, and please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or deeper dives that we could have.
Yep. Emails are here, either through LinkedIn or email. You can reach either of us. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.